Does size matter? And do you get what you pay for? Does size matter? Because we've got the... Maybe the new £50 champion, the Bogasing M4. But look, about 50 quid, about 45 quid, the WKing D8 Mini. We know WKing give us some really good value speakers, most noticeably WKing D8, D9, the X10, blah, blah, blah. And it's that big. If it's that big against a small speaker, it's going to be brilliant. It's going to be, well, yes, I did already review this. I wasn't that glowing about it. So, does that size overcome the value of the Bogasing? We don't know why it's called Bogasing M4. I'm sure they could have come up with a better name, but they didn't. China do not seem to care about how they name the speakers, as long as they are good value speakers. All these speakers are made in China, even though, oh, by the way, probably the most unnecessarily over-the-top startup sound. Boom, 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 boom. 120 quid, 120 quid, 50 quid, 45 quid, can only be one winner, can it? Because you get what you pay for in this world, don't you? Oh, do you? I don't know. Well, they shrunk it, it's quite small. Sometimes you pay a hell of a lot just because it's smaller. The thing about the Marshall speakers is, oh, it's not made by Marshall, but it's got the Marshall name. Do you know, if I had Queen Elizabeth II embroidered onto my t-shirt instead of Alan Ross Reviews, would that make me Queen Elizabeth II? If you don't know, Queen Elizabeth II is the Queen in the UK right now and for the foreseeable future. But does that make me the Queen? No. They pay a licence fee to Marshall. The Sound Industries make this speaker. They make all the Marshall speakers. And it looks like they had an agreement. They sat round, they had lunch, and they said, yeah, tell you what, give us a few quid. You can use our name, but make your speakers look like our amplifiers and people won't know if they're coming and going. So... yes, they look like the Marshall amplifiers. It says Marshall on it, but do you know what? Marshall do not make these speakers. These speakers are made by Sound Industries and actually produced in China. As we already knew, almost 90% of this, 99% of the speakers we come across now, made in China. But coming out, what are you talking about? I was trying to tell you. I'm trying to answer two questions. Does money make the difference? 120 quid, 50 quid? Or does size make the difference? 45 quid, but it's much bigger. 50 quid. Smaller, I'm saying 50 quid. Can't get it in the UK at the moment. But I got this from Amazon.com anyway. Still cost me about 50 quid. Gonna go on with the whole point of this one. I know this is maybe not the most exciting video I've ever done. And nobody's asked for this. Who asked for this, Al? Did your mum ask for it? No, she didn't. Nobody asked me for this. But I just thought it may be interesting because we're used to... well, I haven't really thought of any review up to now, apart from the first time I reviewed the WKing D8 Mini. Where would it make sense? And it doesn't make sense other than I want a bit more ad revenue. I pay for the speaker. I do keep my speakers because I never know what I'm going to use them for comparisons down the line. And it may be of interest to you because they still make it. It's still out there. It's still popular. Where does the Bogasing M4 really stand? I'm still trying to make up my mind. Is it the £50 world champion? And it's 120 quid. Well, we already knew, you know, the Soundcore Boost probably sounds a little bit better than the Marshall Emberton, but it's 120 quid. I guarantee you, there's going to be somebody out there looking through Amazon. Oh, look at that. It's a small speaker, 120 quid. That must be brilliant. No, well, I'm going to answer that in this video. It's already too long, so let's get straight in. 50% volume test. Bogasing M4. It's got the most extended bass, it's got the best bass, it's the most dynamic sounding. Oh, by the way, it was in default mode. Below 50% now, I'm going to be using default mode. Above 50%, I'm going to be using so-called super bass mode. It's got nothing to do with super bass, of course. It's actually a balance mode. But hey-ho, in China, nothing makes sense other than they make good value speakers. So it sounds punchy. It's got a decent bass weight, and it's got decent bass depth. But yeah, it's V-shaped and very bright. Not everybody will love that V-shaped nature, but I think it works at lower volumes. The D8 Mini sounds a bit dull, a bit thin. And the £120 Marshall Emberton, not made by Marshall, sounds nice. It sounds okay, but it lacks bass weight. It is fizzy. Of course, the thing about Marshall you may or may not know, but if you watch all my other videos, which I hope you do, you already know, there's this thing about Marshall that, I don't know, every speaker, they kind of describe it a little bit different, but they claim drumline processing, stereo surround processing, we do amazing things, it's got a 360-degree sound and 2 drivers like everybody else, but hey-ho, we make it sound like it's coming from everywhere. It's around, a bit of reverb, a bit of echo seems to be about all they're doing. Maybe a little bit of summing to each speaker over and above what you'd get with a normal left-right stereo. A hell of a lot of marketing and a lot less going in. The only one I really like at the moment is the Marshall Stockwell 2. Each Marshall I've tried since then been a little bit more disappointing. But it's not terrible. But £120, you would not want it to be terrible. It sounds quite nice. If you want a speaker that's smaller than the M4, could be your guy, but just not because of how thick it is. I think they could do a bit better in the bass department. Doesn't seem to be the sound industry's sound signature way. Well, you've already guessed it. It's about 50% volume. Hey, I think the Bogasing M4 wins, so we're going to have to try a bit louder. Real world volumes in terms of what Alan Ross says, and it's Alan Ross video. What Alan Ross says goes. About 75% volume, all these 3 speakers.
You swore that time was our last goodbye. You called me round for another night. Won't you save me from your love? Save me from your love. Save me from your love and just say goodbye. You swore to leave me. I took you down. It's just the cycle around and around. Won't you save me from your love? Save me from your love. Save me from your love and just say goodbye. Time was our last goodbye. You called me round for another night. Won't you save me from your love? Save me from your love. Save me from your love and just say goodbye. You swore to leave me. I took you down. It's just the cycle around and around. Won't you save me from your love? Save me from your love. Save me from your love and just say goodbye.
So the Bogasing M4, it does sound fuller, it does sound warmer than these other 2 speakers that are either bigger or cost a lot more. As I said, pleasant enough sounding, it's quite a bright speaker, lacks bass, you know, in my terms. Not everybody loves bass, but in my terms, there's obvious lack of bass weight given the amount of money you spend on this and given what other speakers like the Soundcore Boost have shown you can get out of speakers of that size. The D8 Mini, 2 upper bass prominent, it lacks sparkle, and it's hard-edged sounding. Have you guessed? I don't really like the D8 Mini, but hey-ho, ad revenue, please. I've put it in this video, but as I said, joking aside, people are going to be interested because of the price level. It's bigger and it's about the same price, slightly cheaper. People are going to think, oh, maybe that's the one to go for. No, not unless it's going to do something magic at maximum volume. You know, on paper, 30 watts the D8 Mini, 40 watts. We laugh in your face. We know it's not really 40 watts. and 20 watts. Quite reasonable on paper, but paper specs these days are almost meaningless. It's a sad state of affairs. But we'll find out when we push these speakers to maximum volume, 100% volume test.
So keep my mouth shut and not listen. Afraid I lose you if I didn't. Till we find what we're missing and compromise. So I keep my shoes home and not leaving. We're on thin ice, winter season. Can we find a single reason not to say goodbye? Oh, if I said what's on my mind, would you stay with me tonight? If I said what's on my mind, would that make you run and hide? Run and hide. Run and hide. If I said what's on my mind, would that make you run and hide? Would that make you run and hide? Run and hide. Run and hide. Oh, would that make you run and hide? Don't know what to do anymore. I'm out of options, nothing's working. I'm out of service. Come help me now, I'm fucking nervous. I'm trying but can't scratch the surface. So I keep my mouth shut and not listen. Afraid I lose you if I didn't. Can we find what we're missing and compromise? So I keep my shoes home and not leaving. We're on thin ice, winter season. Can we find a single reason not to say goodbye? Oh, if I said what's on my mind, would you stay with me tonight? If I said what's on my mind, would that make you run and hide? Run and hide. Run and hide. If I said what's on my mind, would that make you run and hide? Would that make you run and hide?
Bogasing M4 in default mode is the loudest, only by half a decibel up on the D8 Mini in its EQ mode, but the EQ mode of the D8 relies solely on its highs for volume. So in terms of balance and bass, M4 in default mode has a better balance. It's 6 decibels up on the D8 in its EQ mode at 60 Hz. It's not a great listen EQ mode on the D8 Mini. The default mode is a bit more balanced for the D8 Mini, but then it's 2 decibels behind the M4 in terms of overall loudness, and it's still behind in terms of bass, and it still sounds a bit hard-edged. The Emberton lacks any bass at all, really. It's not a great listen. It has no impact now at maximum volume, while super bass mode, even behind the Emberton in terms of overall loudness, does retain some balance, still retains more bass than the Emberton. In terms of deep bass, it's 8 decibels up at 60 Hz, it's 2 decibels up on the Mini in its default mode at 60 Hz, 3 decibels up on D8 in its EQ mode. So what's going on? Why is super bass mode so much quieter than the M4? Is it because it's pushing more bass? Well, no. The M4 in its default mode has more upper bass, mid bass and deep bass while going louder. It has more mids and it has about the same highs as the super bass mode. So you'd have to say that looks like it's artificially limited in terms of volume super bass mode. There's nothing going on in its default mode to make it go louder in terms of reducing bass and pushing mids and highs, which is what you'd expect. It is bigger, but it's not the loudest speaker on this table. But hey ho, all sound modes are included in the maximum volume test, which means there is a loud mode on the WKing D8 Mini. Of course, it reduces bass and increases the highs. That's how they're able to go louder. It takes more of the amp to drive the bass. So if you don't drive the bass, you can go louder by pushing the mids and the highs. And that's the weird thing about the Bogasing M4. Yes, default mode, 3D mode, goes the loudest, and super bass mode is surprisingly quiet. Surely that means, well then 3D mode must actually reduce the bass so it can go up. No. There's more bass. There's more bass and there's more mids and there's more highs in default mode than there is in the super bass mode. So that makes no sense at all, other than maybe they're just not pushing the amp. Maybe the first time ever for a Chinese speaker, they thought, oh no, we don't want distortion, even though it could go louder. So they've minimized distortion for super bass mode, maximize distortion, because default mode, about 50%, you are going to get a bass that is wildly out of control. Doesn't sound awful. I mean, you could still listen to it, but there's obvious distortion. It's obviously out of control, and it's very, very bright, quite hard-edged. I'm describing it as sounding terrible. I don't think it's that terrible when you're listening to... I've heard worse speakers. Indeed, the EQ mode on the WKing D8 Mini sounds worse, and that mode actually goes louder on the Bogasing, weirdly named M4. But I'm just pointing out the fact that super bass mode clearly could have gone louder. Almost seems to be artificially limited for some reason in its volume, other than, given the benefit of the doubt, they're trying to minimize distortion. But it goes the loudest. Sounds better than the slightly quieter EQ mode on the D8. I don't like the D8 Mini. You've already guessed that. I think it's dull. There's no magic about it, even though it's cheap and looks like the D8 is bigger brother, which does deliver dollops of big bass and has, and it has a place in the market. I don't know why you'd ever choose that over anything else. But 45 quid, I've paid the money. I want some more ad revenue. Bogasing M4, there you go. It goes the loudest. Goes the loudest, but the quietest mode is the most listenable mode, which is the super bass mode, but still more listenable than the Marshall Emberton, which completely, it vanishes all bass to enable it to go louder. So it's not a good listen. Still, to me, you could default 3D mode, even though I've described it as almost being sounding awful. To me, it's not awful. That's listenable. And if I don't need the volume, super bass mode is still listenable, even though it's not quite as loud. So either mode, I think, outdoes these other two speakers. It's a shame. Yes, it looks nice. It looks like an amplifier. It says Marshall, but it's not made by Marshall. Oh, and then don't get me started on blumline processing. Blumline processing, of course, is a thing in recording, not in playback of stereo. If you know different answers on a postcard, as far as I can see, blumline processing is they're trying to make money on the name of blumline. Of course, invented stereo, the idea of reproducing and manipulating a stereo sound. Yes, that's true. But blumline processing as a thing which they're trying to market, that's not a thing. So I could have told you, I could have started the video by saying, I think this is the best speaker at all volumes, and then you could have switched off, but you wouldn't have got 3 dollops of ads. I would have got absolutely nothing out of it as usual. And what would have been the point? So hopefully you sat through half an hour, whatever this video is, and you still got the answer, and you still enjoyed the video. You're still going to go and tell your mates. You must check out the Alan Ross channel, because it takes half an hour to tell you what I can tell you in 2 minutes. Thank you for watching. See you in my next video.
I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Ain't no project wife, got my logic right, cause I'm not your type. I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Sorry, ma, I ain't get it right. I'ma just live my life. I ain't about that. I ain't about that life.